It's hard to deny that the Sony PlayStation brand is one of the biggest juggernauts in gaming today. If you mention PlayStation to somebody, odds are they'll know exactly what you're talking about. Other than perhaps Nintendo, it's hard to think of a bigger name in modern gaming right now. It's been over 20 years since Sony threw their hat in the video game console ring, and they have seen possibly the biggest mix of results with their systems of any major gaming hardware company to date. From the soaring highs of the PlayStation 2 to the rough start of the PlayStation 3 and the non-start of the ill-fated Vita, Sony has learned many important lessons from their trip-ups and their triumphs of the last 2 decades. The console that started it all, the PlayStation 1, has what might be the most interesting story of all though, and it's part of what makes that system so special. It wasn't long after the beginning of the 1990s when Sony started looking into getting into the console war. The colossal amount of publicity and money that was being generated from the heated war between Nintendo and Sega in the late 80s had bled into the 90s and caught the attention of many home electronics companies. Philips, Panasonic, and Sony were among them, and they all started making moves to get involved once it became obvious that this new frontier was not going away. Sony didn't initially want to start its own front in the war, but rather wanted to team up with one of the giants. Ken Kutaragi, Sony's chief system designer, originally spoke with Sega in 1993 about possibly helping manufacture Sega's next system. The rumors generally convey that Sega of America was in favor of exploring this relationship, while Sega of Japan was not impressed. Sega was also riding high from the success of the Genesis and the Mega Drive at the time, despite the Sega CD and 32X not doing so well. Eventually, Sega did decide to move forward with the Saturn without Sony involved, who quickly turned to Nintendo with a similar proposal. I can't imagine that the folks at Sega don't regret the decision to pass on a partnership with Sony, given how that rivalry turned out, but nevertheless, Sony and Nintendo were moving forward with their CD add-on to the Super Nintendo. The console was going to be primarily developed and manufactured by Sony, and in exchange, the idea was that Sony would also get to manufacture their own standalone system that would play Nintendo's games. It's easy to get lost in all of the theoretical scenarios and how different the gaming landscape would be today if this deal had stuck. Unfortunately, the deal fell through in a rather unceremonious and striking fashion. Sony, along with the rest of the world, learned that the Nintendo PlayStation would not be happening almost immediately after Sony revealed it, once Nintendo and Philips announced they would now be working together, leaving Sony out in the cold. Having now been burned twice, Sony was still determined to get into the gaming fight, but now would have to change tactics. Instead of latching on to a company that was already involved in the console market, Sony would officially go out on their own. The biggest hurdle to this, of course, was going to be establishing relationships with developers and publishers. This is when Ken Kutaragi got to work, and for the better half of a year, he toured the world talking with small studios and showed off the PlayStation's development toolset and the specs for the system, establishing that Sony's upcoming console would be the best place for new games, and Sony quickly amassed a small army of unique exclusive games and ports from other systems and arcades for the imminent system. Once Sega caught wind of the PlayStation's inevitability, they rushed their Saturn to market before they had enough to have a solid, consistent rollout. This strained their relationships with retail stores and thus their consumers, opening yet another door for Sony to show up and say, "We're better." On top of that, the PlayStation had launched at $100 less than the Saturn. The $299 price tag was the perfect cherry on top of the heap of things that Sony had going in its favor, which was interesting since the PlayStation was clearly the more powerful machine and was destined to run 3D games better than the Saturn. Even though the Saturn did see a strong start in the Japanese market, it wasn't long before Sony completely overtook Sega in the 32-bit war, and they ended up spending the majority of that console generation focusing on their bigger rival in Nintendo, who was pushing an odd system that still used cartridges, had a weird controller, and lacked a certain amount of third-party support. So one of the biggest reasons why the PlayStation took off the way it did was because its main competitors were making mistakes. And by the end of the 90s, Nintendo must have certainly been regretting their decision to work with Philips on the CDI, which ended up going basically nowhere. Putting the fear in the companies that turned them away must have been a sweet feeling for Sony, and it is interesting to think of how different things could have been. But by 1997, it was obvious that the Sony PlayStation was a major player and it wasn't going anywhere. They had doubled down on the polygon-based games, the CD format, and their ragtag army of developers, and all of these bets were paying off. Another reason why the PlayStation took off as well as it did was the launch window lineup. Racing games, adventure games, platformers, and lots of near-perfect arcade ports like Raiden were all represented, and there were a few wildcard games to round out the excellent selection right off the bat for PlayStation. Wipeout, Rayman, Kill Leak, and others were all showing off the system's power on top of being great games for the time. There was something for everybody at launch on the PlayStation, and that's a big part of why developers and gamers alike flocked to the system early on. Within a few years, and with the help of some clever marketing and handing out demo discs like candy, the PlayStation was well on its way to selling 100 million consoles. Massive heavy hitters like Metal Gear Solid, Armored Core, Tekken, Final Fantasy, Siphon Filter, Crash Bandicoot, Twisted Metal, Spyro, Chrono Cross, and others just kept coming. The Sony PlayStation saw a steady release of excellent games, many of which were either exclusive or had a superior version on their platform. By the end of the millennium, the truth was undeniable. Sega and Nintendo were getting crushed by their self-inflicted rivalries with Sony. Towards the end of the generation, the PlayStation did reveal that they had one more major trick up their sleeve though, their new controller, the DualShock. As if PlayStation needed any more evidence to make their case to gamers, they put out the controller that would define how modern three-dimensional games would be played for decades, with two separate joysticks that perfected traversal through these three-dimensional worlds that greatly benefited shooters and adventure games in a way that is still largely being replicated by every modern controller. Between the power of the system, the games that were released, the talent and the passion of the developers, the innovative controller, and the attitude that brought in gamers from all ages and walks of life, the Sony PlayStation was really something special. Born from the ashes of Fallout with its competitors, the unbridled success of the PlayStation 1, if nothing else, showed us that we can never really know who's going to take the console throne next.
And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from Gaming Bolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.